Okay, this presentation is one of the applied ethics presentations. This time we are going to be talking about abortion. In this presentation, we will be discussing an argument against abortion given by Marquis. In a future presentation, we will be covering an argument in defense of abortion by Judith Jarvis Thompson. Both of these arguments are likely presenting arguments that you are unfamiliar with. The typical anti-abortion argument appeals to a sanctity of all human life principle. The typical pro-choice argument argues that personhood is what is important and argues that zygotes or a fetus does not meet those requirements. Marquis, however, is not going to make the typical pro-life sanctity of life assumptions. And when we get to Thompson, she will argue that even if we were to assume that a fetus is a full person, though she does not really believe it does not follow that abortion is always wrong. Of course, abortion is a controversial topic, and my goal isn't to turn people to one side of the issue or the other, but to explore two of the more powerful philosophical arguments given regarding abortion and some of the objections to them. Marquis begins by pointing out that most pro-life and pro-choice arguments rest with the status of the fetus. The typical pro-life position, he believes, suffers from being too broad and often rests on a sanctity of human life principle, such as it is always wrong to take a human life. The typical pro-choice view, Marquis thinks, is too narrow and usually rests on a view like being a person is what gives an individual moral worth. Marquis believes that the pro-life view is too broad for the following reason. If being alive and having human DNA were enough to deserve moral protection, then human cancer cells should be protected. They have human DNA. It would also be wrong to have organs removed, or even scratch your own skin and kill cells. It would further rule out removing life support on a brain-dead patient, which might not be an issue one wants to have tied with abortion. Also, it would imply that the death penalty is wrong, and one might independently think that the death penalty is wrong, but it doesn't seem like an issue that should necessarily be determined by one's stance on abortion. Such a principle, it seems, protects far too much. He criticizes the personhood view on the pro-choice side with the opposite problem, with that of being too narrow. This, he says, is because it would not protect infants and newborns who he does not believe would qualify as persons under this view. Likewise, the severely mentally challenged may not qualify fully as persons under this view. So Marquis' criticism is that the pro-choice personhood view would fail to protect many beings that both sides would typically agree should be protected. Now, both sides tried to change the formulations to fix things. For example, the pro-life side might add innocent life to their definition if they still want to allow for capital punishment, and try to tweak their definition in other ways. But he thinks that there are problems with trying to clarify either one of these principles enough for them to work. So Marquis is going to try to argue against abortion using a different strategy. Many, if not most, pro-life arguments approach the position from a religious point of view. Many of the arguments against abortion deal with religious arguments, and the core of the group is generally made up of conservative Christians, at least in the United States. The particular religion may vary from country to country. More liberal Christians who don't believe abortion is wrong also sometimes try to use scripture to back up their case, such as the fact that in the Bible causing a woman to miscarry was not treated as murder but resulted only in a fine, a small fine. This is saying something considering that at this time the death penalty and severe corporal punishments were handed out for what we would think of today as very minor offenses. So this is often cited as evidence that a fetus was not seen as a person. Conservative Christians, arguing against abortion, cite passages that indicate that God is familiar with people before they are born, and so the quotations go back and forth. Marquis is going to deliberately try to avoid religious arguments, not because he isn't religious, he's Catholic, but because he wants to show that there are reasons to object to abortion even if you don't hold on to some particular religious belief. So, what is Marquis' strategy? It is to start off with an unproblematic case of murder. This would be a case that both pro-lifers and pro-choicers would almost all be in agreement that killing is wrong. He then wants to examine why it is that we think killing is wrong in that case. He will then try to determine why killing is wrong in the unproblematic case. The idea is this: if abortion turns out to have the same relevant properties to the unproblematic case, then the same principles that show that the unproblematic case of killing is wrong should show that abortion is wrong also. So let's consider an uncomplicated case of murder. Marquis believes that regardless of one's religious upbringing, political leanings, or favorite ethical theory, almost everybody would condemn murder as ethically wrong. Remember, this is supposed to be an unproblematic, uncomplicated case. This isn't a case of self-defense, or capital punishment, or mistaken identity, or anything else that could confuse the situation. Consider this case to be a clear case of cold-blooded murder. A case like that of Jesse James shooting somebody for snoring too loudly. The kind of murder nobody would defend. The next step is to ask why it is wrong. Marquis considers three general categories of possibilities as to why cold-blooded killing might be wrong. The first may seem a little strange to you at first. This is the idea that killing somehow brutalizes the killer herself or himself. This comes from the idea that when somebody does something morally bad, they are harming themselves or their souls, and that this is what makes it wrong. But Marquis does not think that this is a good explanation of the wrongness of the killing, because this makes it seem as if the wrongness of the killing depends upon an injury to the killer, but the act already seems to be immoral. Indeed, if one took this position, the claim would seem to be that the killer is somehow harming him or herself because the killing is already wrong, which implies that the killing is wrong for some reason already. Keep in mind that Marquis isn't ruling out the possibility that this might be an additional reason that killing is wrong. Killing might also be wrong because of what the killer does to himself or herself. But Marquis does not think that this is the primary explanation as to why killing is wrong, even if it may supply some additional reason. Okay, then, how about this possibility? Killing is wrong because of the loss it would cause to those left behind. The loss it causes to the victim's family and friends, for example. Also the loss to society. This person's creative potential and the work potential are lost, so society loses out. This is another potential explanation as to why the killing is wrong. But Marquis doesn't think that this works either, for the simple reason that if this were the only reason why killing were wrong, then it would imply that it would be morally okay to kill hermits. A hermit is somebody who has isolated herself or himself from society. Imagine somebody who has done this so completely that nobody would miss this person if they were gone. This person is completely isolated and has no relatives or friends. This person is self-sufficient in the woods and does not trade or exchange anything with society. Even if there were such a person out there, we still believe, presumably, that it would be wrong to kill her or him. Again, this doesn't mean that harms to society cannot be an additional reason why killing is wrong. Killing might be made more wrong because of the losses it causes to society. But again, Marquis does not think that this works as the primary explanation for the reason why killing is wrong. So, this leaves open what Marquis calls the third class of possibilities. The first class was that the killer harms herself. The second was that society is harmed. The third class is that the primary reason killing is wrong is because of the harm to the victim. Marquis thinks that this is the right area and that this is also the most intuitive. But we still have to state the kind of harm. There are several kinds of harms that might be done to the victim that make killing wrong. Also note, it isn't exactly easy to say what the harm to the victim of a killing is, since once the killing is over, the victim no longer exists. Marquis considers three major possibilities. The first possibility is that killing is wrong because it causes the victim pain. But Marquis does not think that this works. This is because we still think that killing would be wrong even if the victim could be killed in a completely painless way, say by being killed by a method that destroyed the brain faster than neurons could fire. Another possibility is that the murder is wrong because of the fear that killing instills in the victim. But Marquis does not think that this will do either, because it would imply that killing would then be okay if one killed the victim and the victim didn't know it was coming. such as killing the victim in her sleep or by surprise, or so quickly that there was no chance of fear. No. Instead, Marquis sees the real harm in killing as something much more similar to theft or to vandalism. Here is why. Killing deprives the victim of all she or he currently values. It deprives the victim of anything they would value in the future. It deprives them of all their current experiences. And it deprives them of all their future experiences. In short, Marquis says, the loss of one's life deprives one of all the experiences, activities, projects, and enjoyments that would otherwise have constituted one's future. This is Marquis' future like ours argument. Killing is wrong because it deprives the victim of a future like ours. That is to say, the future of a being psychologically similar to ourselves. Marquis believes that whatever natural property we identify with the wrongness of killing should, first, fit with our intuitions, and second, no other natural property should explain it as well. And he thinks that the criteria or property of depriving the victim of a future like ours fits the bill. Again, this is the future like ours argument. So, the idea would then be to take this general principle and apply it to abortion. Marquis believes that his principle has several strengths in terms of accounting for the wrongness of killing. First, it would be wrong to kill aliens from outer space if their psychological lives are sufficiently like our own. Second, it includes the possibility that it might be wrong to kill some animals that have a psychological future similar enough to ours. Note that the sanctity of human life principle cannot account for this. Third, the principle does not entail a sanctity of human life principle as many pro-life arguments do, and so does not automatically entail that it is impermissible to have euthanasia or the death penalty and so forth, nor does it require religious assumptions. Fourth, it does entail that it is wrong to kill infants and children, since they do have a future like ours. Fifth, it does not rest on the claim that since it is wrong to kill persons, it is wrong to kill potential persons also. Equating something potential with something actual is a real weakness of many pro-life claims. Potential, by definition, means not yet. We don't let potential surgeons, people who might potentially learn how to be doctors, perform surgery, for example. Potential farmland does not produce crops. When you say something is potentially something else, you admit that it is not that thing yet. Sixth, it does not hold that all abortions are necessarily wrong. The fetus must have a future like ours. Seventh, it does not have to be the sole reason why killing is wrong. Marquis believes that this approach has the strengths of both the sanctity of life principles and the personhood principles. So, to clarify, this is an outline of the future like ours argument. The reasoning goes as follows. It is murder to deprive something of a future like ours. This is the principle we just argued for. Zygotes, blastulas, fetuses, and so forth usually have a future like ours. Therefore, human abortions, which kill these things, are usually morally wrong for a similar reason to murder or unjustified killing. The usually here is important. As noted in the previous page, Marquis' argument might not rule out abortions of fetuses when the fetus does not have a future like ours, for example. Such a case might be like the baby Teresa case, where there only exists a brainstem. In such a case, the baby would never have a psychological future like ours, and so the future like ours argument does not itself provide an argument against abortion in this case. Marquis says that to undermine his future like ours argument, one would have to give another account of why killing is wrong that is just as intelligible, but which has different results for the abortion issue. Next, Marquis anticipates and tries to counter some possible objections to his argument. Here's one possibility. Maybe we can say that instead of killing being wrong because it denies something a future like ours, maybe we can say that it is wrong because it discontinues the experiences of the victim. This would undermine this principle's strength as an attack against abortion because one would need to have experiences before they can be discontinued, and one likely cannot have these experiences until the brain is sufficiently developed. Marquis does not think that this works as an objection, because first, he does not think that the objection makes sense unless we already think that the future is valuable. In other words, unless we already admit to the value of a future like ours. And second, he thinks that it would imply that it is wrong to kill somebody who is in misery and begging to die due to some disease, since that person would have an experience to end. One might question whether or not Marquis is giving a generous reading to this objection, however. One might think that a future is valuable, but only to beings who have experiences already. As to the second objection, this is to a bare experience account, but there is no reason that mere experiences should be valued and not say experiences like ours instead. After all, Marquis already is invoking the like ours descriptor in his future account. A second objection Marquis considers is the possible objection that maybe what is wrong with killing is that it undermines a fundamental desire of the victim. Call this the fundamental desire account. But Marquis finds fault with this for two reasons. First, because we believe that it would be wrong to kill somebody with little desire to live. For example, somebody who is not terminally ill, but who is suicidal. Second, he thinks that there is a deeper flaw. He thinks his own account is fundamentally better because it explains the desire for life. We value the good life brings, he thinks, which fits the future like ours theory. Do you think that these objections are sufficient? One might wonder if Marquis is fully fleshing out the objections here. People, for example, seem to desire life for multiple reasons. Likewise, one might have a more sophisticated account of desiring life that is not immediately forfeited upon casual thoughts of suicide or with the illness of depression. But we will see a more sophisticated example of this considered with Tooley in a moment, so we'll let this pass for now. A third objection Marquis considers is that it is the actual act of valuing one's future that makes the future valuable. Again, if this is what made killing wrong, it would undermine the argument against abortion because, without a certain level of brain development, the mental act of valuing is likely not possible. But Marquis does not think that this works well as a principle because he thinks that a person's future could have value even in a moment of despair when one ceases to value it. Marquis also argues that somebody's future can be valuable to a person even if that person doesn't actually value it. He gives the example of someone who attempts suicide being happy to be rescued. And this seems to happen a lot. Many people who attempt suicide regret it immediately after the attempt. This seems to be true in that many people who attempt suicide and fail realize as soon as they try that it was a mistake. But again, we need to examine the strength of his responses to these counter-arguments. One might, for example, say that what is important is that the victim really value his or her life, not that he or she believes that it has no value mistakenly on one level. Obviously, if such a person takes a suicidal action and regrets it, this person really did think that her or his life had value after all. What that person did was make a mistake. Another possibility is that the position could be that what is important isn't the valuing, but being capable of valuing one's life that makes it important. Marquis also considers an objection by Tooley, which is similar to the modification we just considered on the last slide. This objection is that an entity cannot have a right to life unless it has the capacity to desire its continued existence. Presumably, a fetus or a zygote would not have this capacity. Marquis objects that a person could have a right to something without knowing about it. For example, a person might have a right to medical treatment to save her life without knowing it and thus not having the capacity to desire it. Marquis is perhaps committing the fallacy of equivocation here. He seems to be confusing Tooley's criterion of a psychological capacity with an epistemological capacity brought about by limited information. Tooley is making a claim that organisms do not have a moral right to life unless they are capable of psychologically desiring their own continued existence. Marquis seems to be confusing this understanding of a right to life with a legal right to a life-saving procedure based on information available to an organism, not based on its psychological or cognitive capabilities. This brings us to the final and perhaps most serious objection to Marquis' argument. This is the argument that Marquis' position would also imply that contraception is morally wrong. Why might one think this? Because, just like abortion, contraception prevents a being from having a future like ours. Marquis does not think it does. His objection lay with locating the victim. He says that there are only 4 possibilities for a victim. The first is some sperm, but Marquis says that this answer would be arbitrary. Why some sperm instead of some ovum? Both have half the DNA. The other possibility is that the ovum is the victim, but this is arbitrary for the same reason. Why the ovum and not the sperm? A third possibility is to say that the sperm and the ovum separately are victims, but Marquis says that this doesn't work because that would be one too many victims. The argument is that a victim would be deprived of the future like ours, not multiple victims. The fourth and final possibility is to consider the sperm and egg together as a unit. Here Marquis' objection is that there is nothing for the definite article, by which he means the specific entity that is the victim, to attach to. He says that all you have are combinations of many sperms and an ovum without any way of knowing which combination, if any, would result in germination. It is probably only Marquis' response to the fourth argument that is relevant, since people making this line of argument are likely not considering either the sperm or ovum separately or both as a group but apart. So what do you think of Marquis' responses? Are they strong enough? Marquis' response here does seem to suffer from a real weakness. He seems to be confusing epistemology, what we know, with metaphysics. What is the case? It might be impossible to know which sperm will match with which ovum on which occasion. But we know that some sperm will pair with some ovum on some occasion. Given this, we know that contraception is in fact denying a being a future like ours, according to Marquis' argument. Just because we don't know which sperm-egg combination is being deprived of a future like ours doesn't excuse us in taking away its future if we agree with Marquis that the future is what is morally valuable. Our ignorance of who we were robbing of this future doesn't excuse our theft. Imagine, for example, that a mad poisoner put an untraceable poison pill in a random bottle of aspirin at an aspirin factory. The poison is slow-acting and kills a person in such a way that it looks just like natural causes. Once the poison pill is lost amid the normal aspirin, even the poisoner does not know who has been poisoned by the pill because millions of people take aspirin and many people die in ways that are consistent with the natural causes look that the poison would cause. Are we really going to say that just because we don't know which pill matched with which person to deprive that person of a future like ours, the poisoner isn't guilty of murder? We know that somebody was killed, we just don't know who. Analogously, we know that some sperm and some egg were denied a future, we just don't know which one. So, if denying something a future like ours were enough to make something immoral, it would seem to follow from Marquis' reasoning that contraception would be immoral too. But it's even worse than this, because it isn't just contraception that prevents a sperm and egg from having a future like ours. Any time you spend not procreating when you could be reproducing is also denying a sperm-egg pair a future like ours, assuming that you're fertile. Without a better counter-argument, Marquis' argument might seem to apply that we are morally required to be constantly pregnant if we're women, and to be constantly impregnating people if we are men. And that ends this presentation. The main points to get are Marquis' future like ours argument, what his reasoning is, and all the steps in his argument, as well as to understand some possible counter-arguments and how he tries to deal with them. The next presentation will be regarding Judith Jarvis Thompson's defense of abortion. Until next time.